the title of the presentation is a sociolinguistic study of the palatal fricative in Venezuelan Spanish. And next. So the current project is a study of the Venezuelan palatal fricative in a diachronic corpus, examining this under a studied variable. The corpus include sociolinguistic stratified sample from the 80s and the 2000s. We'll see that later. And overall, this study contributes to the current understanding of phonetic variation in Caribbean Spanish, showing an ongoing sociolinguistic change. We compare data across time, and we look at linguistics and sociolinguistic factors constraining or conditioning this variable. Next. So in terms of previous literature, we see some work, previous work, particularly in Spain, looking at a descriptive, what we see in the previous papers is a description of previous or different variants of the palatal fricative. And so we have the work of Roche from 2017, describing an ongoing process and different variants of the sociolinguistic variable. Next. So numerous studies have examined sibilant production in Argentina and Spanish. That's another side of the literature. So we have the work of Fontanella de Weinberg, Chan, Rogena Madrazo. And in Spain, we have the work of Roche and Molina Martos. Molina Martos particularly point to a continuum of increasing tension in the way that she describes allophones in Madrid Spanish. Next. So in terms of what we know from the Southern Cone, we have the work of, well, here we have, a reference again to the work in Spain that we already talked about. But then we have some studies in Colombian Spanish and in Cuba looking at this variable as well. Next. And so here we have the reference to the work in Buenos Aires again. And what we want to see here, or we want to point out, is that in the 70s, women were leading this change in Argentina. And then in the work of Rogena Madrazo from 2015, he sees that there is variation in the older generation, but the younger generation seems to be favoring the, categorically the voiceless variant. Next. So our research questions are: what allophones of the palatal fricative are identified in the Caribbean variety of Caracas? What linguistic and extralinguistic factors condition production of variants of the palatal fricative? And do real and apparent time trends suggest increased use of the approximate variant, as we have described in previous research? Next. So here we have information about the corpora we use. This is a diachronic corpus comprising samples from 87 and the 2000s. These are samples that are socially stratified. Next. So in terms of the acoustic analysis, it was conducted by Pratt, using Pratt, and the research team determined a coding scheme based on the acoustic features of the different variants. So here we have distinguished an affricate, which is voiced, a fricative, an approximant, and an elided variant. Next. So here we have an example of the affricate production. Can you play it?
Andrea Mayorque. Andrea Mayorque.
We have an example of the fricative variant. Can you play it? Next. This is an example of the approximate production. And here we have an example of the elided variant.
Porque allí, porque allí.
So in terms of the independent variables, the linguistic variables include the preceding context, the following context, tonicity, and duration. And for the extra linguistic variables, we consider age, gender, socioeconomic status, formality, and corpus. Next.
All right.
So now Matt will take over with the results.
Yeah, thank you, Manuel. So overall, 1,171 allophones of the palatal fricative were coded, and we decided to use a mixed effect regression model to treating speakers as random effects in order to examine how social and linguistic factors influence production. We started out with a slightly different model, though, to try and justify the impressionistic and acoustic coding and ensure that there was something that seemed to be happening at that level. So that started us off with a linear regression, comparing intensity range across these four production types. So just descriptively, we see that the range in decibels for affricates, as we would probably expect, because there should be some sort of occlusion there, is much higher. Whereas for fricative, approximate, and elision, something seems to be differing across these productions as well, possibly relating back to Molina Martos's continuum of increasing tension. So there is some distinction in these production types. Following that, we carried out a binary logistic regression in which we took fricatives, approximates, and elision and grouped them in contrast to the affricate production, since the affricate was the most distinct. And then finally, we removed the affricates altogether and compared the fricatives, which were the second most distinct, from the approximate and elided contexts. So I'm going to go through those now. So first of all, for the range and intensity, this linear regression that I mentioned, we see that realizations did follow a statistically significant difference. Affricates tended to favor the highest intensity range, whereas fricatives, approximates, and elision disfavored it, although fricatives were the closest to the midpoint as far as the log odds went. For preceding context, we see that pauses and obstruents favored greater tension, whereas sonorants, mid-vowels, high vowels, and low vowels did not. And as far as tonicity went, stressed syllables, as we might expect, favored increased tension, whereas the atonic contexts disfavored it. The takeaway here was that the impressionistic coding does seem to significantly reflect some drop in intensity, which in turn may be reflecting a difference in occlusion or even tension type. And then here is just looking at the tonicity and the realization type. We see that affricates were produced much longer, but that there is this trend across all production types for more tonic syllables, or for the stressed syllables, to also have a longer or a greater range in intensity. So now moving into the two logistic regressions comparing those codings. For the affricate, compared to all other production types, the affricates tended to favor pauses, sonorants, and high vowels in preceding contexts, as well as stressed syllables. Female speakers tended to use it more. The more recent speakers from 2008 to 2013 tended to use it more. Longer segments favored the affricate, and formality, which we coded based on the timestamp, so production earlier in the interview, tended to favor production of the affricate, which may, as we'll talk about later, correlate with some sociolinguistic variables. We're going to just look through some of these things now and sort of explore what's happening before I move on to the last model. So first, comparing tonicity and corpus year, we see that in the 2004 to 2013 corpus, affricate production increased across both groups, and approximate production fell. And for tonicity, more affricates are produced in tonic syllables overall, while more approximates are produced in atonic ones. So this also seems to follow, as far as tonicity goes, what we might expect based on additional stress being placed, leading to an affricate or even occlusive addition into this segment. Now comparing duration and corpus year, we see that affricates are the longest segments in both corpora. We'll see that in several points. And then by corpus year, we see that overall there was this tendency in the more recent corpus, interestingly, for the segments to just be shorter overall, which may relate to something more in the audio itself than in the corpus. But it's something that I think we want to explore a little further.
I think you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Looking at gender in corpus year, we see that men used the fricative and elided variants more, whereas women used more affricates. And then also across time, in 2004 to 2013, affricate use increased while approximate use dropped among women and fricative use rose. So we do see these shifting norms across both the genders and the time period of collection. For socioeconomic status, middle-class speakers had a massive increase over time in the affricate and the fricative, and as well as a small drop in the approximate use from 1987 to 2004. Working class speakers showed a small drop in approximate use and elision in favor of the affricate and fricative, whereas upper class speakers across both time periods stayed almost stable. Looking at speaker age, we see that middle-aged speakers had the largest drop in approximate use across the corpora and a raise in affricate and fricative use. And there's an interesting possibility for real-time change that I'll discuss near the end, in that young speakers in 1987, you would expect them to have reached middle age by 2004. Middle-aged speakers would reach the elderly group. So essentially, everybody would age up by one group across these two corpora. And if we look at it in that way, there's this drop from both of these groups, the young and the middle age group in 1987, moving into the 2004 to 2013 corpus. There's this sizable drop across both of those. And interestingly, right here in the approximate production for the younger speakers, there's actually a sort of raise both in apparent and possibly real time that I think we need to look at a little bit further. Looking at this idea of formality taken from the timestamp, men and women produced affricates earlier in interviews across both time periods. In the more recent corpus, affricates were produced much earlier by both groups, while elision was produced later than other realizations. This selects a correlation between affricates and increased formality potentially. All right, and then finally in the last logistic model, this follows very similar to what we found for affricates, but this time for fricatives as compared to approximates and elision. Fricatives, like affricates, favor pauses and sonorants, but they also favor obstruents in preceding contexts. They favor stressed syllables. Gender was not predictive here. More recent speakers tended to use them more. Longer segments tended to contain them, and as far as timestamps and formality went, earlier segments in the interview tended to favor the fricative. So it seems like there's a very similar pattern going on for the fricatives as for the affricates, in opposition to the approximates and elision. So there seems to be a clear distinction socially between these groups, as well as linguistically. All right, so moving back to our research questions then. First of all, what allophones of the palatal fricative are identified in this Caribbean variety, Caracas Spanish? So based on waveform consultation and impressionistic coding, and supported by differences in intensity with the segment, 4 realizations are identified in reducing orders of tension. We first have the affricate j, voiced, which is the 4th most likely to be produced overall. That's followed by the fricative in the 2nd position, the approximate in the 1st position, and elision in 3rd position in terms of use. Next, looking at linguistic and extralinguistic factors, what conditions production of variance in the palatal fricative? As far as linguistic factors go, the affricate is favored in preceding pause favors preceding pauses, sonorants, and high vowels, stressed syllables, and longer durations. The fricative is very similar: preceding pauses, sonorants, and obstruents, stressed syllables, and longer durations. And the other two, the approximates and elided variants, would then in turn favor preceding high, mid, and low vowels, use in unstressed syllables, and shorter durations. Looking at the extralinguistic factors, affricates tend to be used by women in the more recent corpus and earlier in interviews. Fricatives are similar, although gender drops out. And the approximate and elided variants tend to be used by men in the 87 corpus and later in interviews. Moving on to the third question, do real or apparent time trends suggest increased use of the approximate variant, as Montero Bernal and Rodriguez Cadena have shown previously for Colombian and Cuban Spanish? Yes, but I think we do have a caveat that we want to bring up here. While use of the approximate was highest across both corpora, this use does decrease over time in favor of the fricative and affricate. Looking at apparent time, younger speakers differed from other age groups using less fricatives and more approximates in 2004 to 2013. In real time, young and middle-aged speakers from 1984 saw approximate use plunge and fricative use soar in 2004 to 2013. So based on the spectrographic analysis and the acoustic features of the sound signal, we established the 4 categories of allophonic variation of allophonic realizations that we see for the palatal fricative in Venezuelan Spanish. While linguistic factors, including previous context, tonicity, and segment duration, help predict production type, extralinguistic factors suggest social stratification exists in the production of allophones of the palatal variant. The affricate and fricative production seem to possess greater formality and acceptability, while the approximate and elided variants demonstrate characteristics typically associated with an innovative or vernacular variant, including use by male speakers and less formal speaking environments. Real-time analysis shows that approximate use has fallen over time, however. While approximate rates among the young and middle-aged speakers in 87 fell in the more recent corpus, interestingly, like I mentioned before, younger speakers in 04 to 2013 show a rise in both affricate and approximate variants. These are patterns that we can't comment on too much here, but I think they do need further research to uncover exactly what this new sociolinguistic value of approximates may be for younger speakers. As main takeaways, the study performs a detailed acoustic analysis of palatal fricative variants in Caracas Spanish. There is significant variation in production that merits closer phonetic study to determine possible types of variation. And it could also be fruitful, we think, to examine relationships between token frequency and variable fricative, variable fricative production, namely using a usage-based approach to examine if there is something cognitively that might be able to be connected to these different types of productions. This contributes to our understanding of sociophonetic variation in a variety of Caribbean Spanish, and we show that the use of the approximate is dominant in Caracas Spanish, but that there are fluctuations in both real and apparent time which suggest that this production is undergoing change across generations. And this provides insight into the linguistic and social stratification of the Venezuelan palatal fricative for the first time that we know of. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you all very much. We have plenty of time for questions now. We have about 13 minutes for questions. So if anyone has a question, feel free to actually legitimately raise your hand or virtually raise your hand. Either way works.
Question or comments?
And while people are thinking, I have a question or comment, if I may.
Yes.
First and foremost, thank you all so much for your presentation. I think ASMO is fascinating, and I feel like it's one of those features that, as you showed in your lit review, right, they've done a lot of work on it in Argentina and of course in Spain as well. But I do think the more and more studies that we have are showing it's actually very complicated, probably in most places, that there are a lot of other variants. And so I think that's outstanding. I really like the idea of the fact that y'all coded for time in the interview. And I wanted to know more about that. What led you to do that, to kind of look at, right, formality in that sense, and at what was your cutoff, and what were you noticing, and maybe why do you think there was more affricate at the beginning?
I think the motivation comes from a different paper that we presented many years ago. And I think the name is going retro or something like that, isn't it, Matt?
Yeah, it was with you and Michael Gradeville about Pa and Para, I think.
Yeah, so we saw that effect, and so of course that's a very traditional way to look at style. But since we have the samples, that's the only way we can tackle that. Because otherwise we will have to do a different kind of design. Matt, can you talk about the details in terms of the divisions?
Sure. Yeah. So based on that previous study, it had essentially been found that formality, broadly defined, was sort of at its highest for the first 5 to 10 minutes of the interviews, with the less vernacular / innovative variants being produced more at the start and tapering off over time. So based on that, and in order to, I in the past have also just not coded the first 5 to 10 minutes for that reason, but I think it's potentially interesting as a social variable to just look at all of the interview and then code specifically when each production is made in seconds, to then be able to code that continuously and say that if there is some sort of shift, that might be indicating what this previous study showed was a formality effect of some sort.
It's a great idea, right? Because I think a lot of times with any sociolinguistic interview, we throw out first 5-10 minutes, but right, whether their speech is or is not affected by a microphone, it doesn't mean it's not speech, right? They're doing something. So that's, it is super well done. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Katie?
Hi, yes, I have a question, kind of related to the formality and the change across the interview. Do you think, and I know you didn't code for it, so this is just kind of like your perception based off the data, do you think that speech rate would have anything to do with the productions that are being produced kind of later versus early on in the interview? Because I know kind of it can take a while to get really going, so I just wondered if there was a effect for speech rate.
A speech rate would be something to control. I think in terms of statistical analysis, the fact that the individual was included as a possible, as a random effect, not as a possible, as a random effect, just correct that, takes care of some of these individual differences. But of course, if it would be great to code for speech rate, because I think it will have potentially an effect. And we will see faster speech at the end of the interview where they feel comfortable, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's something that, and that's why I sort of said formality writ large. I know there's a lot of discourse about what style is and what formality is. And I think that one way that you could code it, like you were saying, Brendan, is that essentially, having this microphone in front of you, you have these new people in front of you, you may just be talking more slowly, and that may increase over time too. So I found a couple of ways to code for speech rate that I think is really interesting. It adds another level of complexity, but I think it is something that you could try and separate out, like a formality with a new speaker versus just the either nervousness you feel or just how fast you're speaking early on versus later. So that is something that I think would be worth looking into as well. Yeah.
Matthew Canwit.
Hello, thank you both for that very interesting presentation. My question was also related to formality, and I wondered if you've coded or considered coding discourse topic, and you might group together more formal as opposed to informal topics that come up during the interviews, in addition to maybe more emotionally charged or less emotionally charged, like the danger of death or those type scenarios that sometimes come up in these interviews, to see that if people are monitoring less or it's a more informal topic, do you indeed get less of the affricate?
That
do you have any sense from the data?
That's a great suggestion. That's something that we need to do. That's a great suggestion.
Yeah,
thank you both.
Yeah, we didn't code for. We were in a rush really to get this ready.
Well, understand.
I think something else that I think is really interesting. So we're trying to work with the Corpus de Caracas to actually do a forced alignment coding and try and add some other things into it. So if we actually could do topic, you could do it at even the utterance level, because even within a discussion about, where did you go to school, it may become very formal if you're talking about a past teacher, or it may become very emotional if you're talking about somebody who passed away. So I think that that's something that in a large forced aligned corpus, you could actually code potentially for a number of things at the discourse level that would be maybe more fine grained than just saying overall this was fear of death. So probably you were anxious or feeling uncomfortable or emotional. But yeah, it's something that I haven't seen done beyond that level yet, and I think it's something exciting for the future.
Definitely. Thank you.
And we still have plenty of time for questions. We still have about 6 minutes for questions. So I have another question, because this is a great topic. A great presentation. I was interested in, and for me, there was a lot of data. So if I missed something, please correct me. I was intrigued because I think I saw that it seemed like post-pause was, we would assume affricate would be most favored there. And right, I think in all varieties throughout the Spanish-speaking world, they were like, oh, I don't use that. And whenever it's like a post-pause, like, actually, you kind of do use the affricate. Yeah. But I was also intrigued that it showed, at least I think, that also favored the fricative variant. And that surprised me. I was like, oh, wow, I would have thought it would, like, post-pause would like strongly just favor the affricate. And so I'm curious why the fricative then was also, I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily an explanation, but it caught my attention about, oh, this is pretty interesting. And I wonder if there's some kind of interaction happening there with either a social or linguistic factor as well.
I think in part it may just be because all the affricates have been removed at this point. Nothing really favors it a lot, but this, because it looks like it's about 50% tend to of the fricatives tend to be produced post pause. So I think it's a sort of decreasing order of hierarchy, that there's a lot of affricates that are produced post pausally, and then fricatives seem to have the most either formal coding or standardized coding after that, and just seem to come up more. But it's interesting. I guess possibly you could also speak to degrees of tension, that just if it's not going to be an affricate, the next best thing is a fricative. But
Great, thank you.
I think socially that could be interesting to look into more, because I think in interactions we haven't really played with yet. So seeing if there is an interaction between that and something else.
Because I wonder if you did interact that with, say, the corpus dates itself,
Yeah.
right? All right, just something to think about if there is any kind of change happening there, right? To have, like, I don't know, just that postpausal position is an interesting one, particularly with like palatal fricatives. But
so.
yeah, because it just caught my attention. I was like, huh, both in. Yeah, super. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good thought.
So about 3 minutes for questions.
So thank you guys for the presentation. I was just curious, I know this isn't what you were looking at, but I was curious if you noticed with the affricate, like if you had any cases where it was like unvoiced. Because with, like Colombian Spanish, I always just assumed it was voiced, and then I noticed like on the spectrogram, I was like, oh, this isn't voiced. And that was just like it was really surprising. So I don't know if you happen to notice it, and just out of my own curiosity.
That is because, these are sociolinguistic interviews. Some of these cues are difficult to catch.
There's a degree of background noise that may make it look slightly voiced. I think that everything was at least slightly voiced, but with that said, like Manuel's saying, that there's enough noise in the signal that potentially it could be devoiced ch, and you wouldn't really be able to tell.
Yeah, I was just curious because I was like, it like blew my mind. I was like, oh my god, I always thought it was like the ja, but like it's a cha.
It's cha. That's
you
interesting.
just can't when you like zoom in on it, But, so it's just out of curiosity. But thank you guys.
Thank you, Nofia.
Thank you.